guys, it's Courtney and I'm back with part 2 of my 10 cards, 1 kit using the Simon Says Stamp card kit. Today we're going to be making 5 very simple cards going kind of back to the basics. So I'm going to be using a lot of the pattern papers and the stickers in the stamp set. So my first 2 cards do not involve any stamping at all. So for my first one, I'm taking the largest stitched rectangle die by Simon Says Stamp, and I'm going to go ahead and cut out that pattern paper as well as the stitched square die for that little sentiment that you can cut apart, but I decided to die cut it just to kind of give it a little bit of added interest. And the sentiment's already on there, so it has no stamping at all. So this was looking a little bit too plain. So what I ended up doing is I ended up taking some of the pink cardstock that comes in the kit, and I'm just measuring this stitched rectangle or stitched square, if I can speak, and just cutting a piece of that cardstock just slightly larger than the stitched rectangle and the stitched square. And I'm going to go ahead and layer these just to kind of give each one of these a border and make them pop out a little bit. So I'm going to glue everything down flat using my Tombow Mono multi glue, and I liked this a whole lot better. Once everything was adhered, I'm going to go ahead and stick this onto a white A2 size note card. And I'm not used to this simple. Some people are great with pattern paper. I struggle with it. It's way out of my comfort zone. I know back in the day when I first started crafting, this was my only zone before I learned to color and things like that. But this is kind of getting back to the basics for me in order to add a little bit added interest to it and not just leave it the way it is. I decided to take some glossy accents and cover up that heart that's part of that stitched square. So what I do for the glossy accents is I'm going to start to go around the heart and kind of just go around the shape of the heart and then fill the rest of it in. I know I've mentioned this before. If you guys have ever decorated sugar cookies with royal icing, this is exactly the way you do it. You outline it and then fill it in, and it will kind of merge all together. The areas that don't, or if you have any air bubbles, you can kind of go in and pop those once everything is filled in. This will take a little bit of time to dry, and it looks a little bit cloudy right now, but once it dries, it will be completely clear. I also took some of the vintage Nouveau drops and added a few of those as well. You'll see in the final photos, I accidentally put a piece of paper on top of it before it was dry, so some of them smeared. It's not perfect, but it's handmade, so it's not supposed to be perfect. So that is the first card. Now for the second card, I'm also going to stick to some pattern paper and no stamping on this one either. So I'm kind of just going through to see what I have, see what I want to work with here. And I loved this little bird in the nest. So I'm going to go ahead and die cut that out with a stitched circle die. And then I'm kind of just going through to see which pattern paper I like best that kind of goes along with this as well. I ultimately decided to use 2 separate papers here. I liked this floral design, but I also liked that stripe, that yellow stripe design. So I used both of them. Going to, again, use that large stitched rectangle die by Simon to cut out that floral pattern paper and my little circle. And then I'm going to use a border die for, actually, I cut the striped paper out with that same die as well, so it would be the same exact size. And next, I'm going to use a border die, and this is by Lawn Fawn. I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head, but I will find it and I will link it below. I'm going to use some Post-it note tape to make sure this stays in place while I run this through my Gemini. And I'm just using my grid mat to make sure that I line this die up perfectly. Stick that down with Post-it note tape and run that through my Gemini. And this will give me both patterns and kind of have a border that kind of separates the two. So next I'm going to go ahead and adhere everything down to an A2 size note card. I wanted to make sure everything was lined up before I stuck anything down. Using that same Tombow Mono multi glue, first I'll go ahead and adhere that striped panel or no, I'm sorry, the floral panel down onto the striped panel. I'm just putting a teeny tiny dot of the glue on that little scalloped border to make sure that that sticks down and doesn't get stuck on an envelope when you stick that in there to mail. And I'll go ahead and stick this down onto an A2 size note card. And then finally go ahead and I'm going to pop up my little circle with my bird with some Scotch foam tape, and ended up taking just 2 of the little heart stickers that are part of the kit as well, and just added those around my little bird. And then finally took a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen just to add a little bit of sparkle to just those hearts. That is card number 2, and we're going to move on to card number 3, which is very simple, but actually involves some stamping this time. So I'm taking a piece of the dark chocolate cardstock from the kit, and I'm using white pigment ink by Hero Arts, and I'm going to use these leaf stamps. And you'll just want to make sure you get really good coverage before bringing this to the paper. But I'm just dabbing it onto the ink pad because this is like really squishy, a lot squishier than like a dye ink pad. So you don't want to squish too hard or else you're just going to get ink everywhere. So I kind of just turn around my stamp to make sure that I'm getting good coverage before I bring that to my card panel. And I'm just using 3 of the leaf stamps here and just scattering those throughout the bottom portion of my card panel. It's going to be a landscape card. And I'm taking just this very small leaf to kind of fill in any blank areas. Now you will want to make sure that this ink is completely dry before moving on to the next step. I gave it about 10 or 15 minutes. You can heat set it and speed up the process, but then your paper doesn't necessarily lay flat, and I just find that it's easier to let it air dry. So next I'm going to bring in the Evergreen Simon Says Stamp Die ink, and I'm going to use the same images, the same stamps that I did the first time. I'm going to go ahead and ink that up, and I'm going to stamp directly, almost directly, over where I stamped with the pigment ink, but just slightly off to the side. And this will kind of give it a, not really a shadow, but I guess a shadow. So it's not going to be as dark. So you're going to want to choose a darker dye ink than what you're looking for, because it is going to look significantly lighter than the actual ink itself. We're stamping on dark cardstock and we're stamping on that white pigment ink. So you're still going to see the green, but it's not going to be as bright or as dark as it normally would be. So just stamping directly or off to the right a little bit for each one of them. And I'm not worried about them all being perfectly even with each other. It is supposed to not be perfect. You don't want it to be perfect. So next, I'm going to go ahead and put this aside to dry for a minute. And for my sentiment, I am going to use one of the stickers from the kit. Now, this is a teeny tiny sticker, and I have a whole lot of blank space on my card panel at this point. So I'm going to create my own embellishment. I'm going to start by sticking down that sticker onto another piece of that dark chocolate cardstock, and then I'm going to bring out my paper trimmer, and I'm using my teeny tiny one here just because I find that easier for sentiment strips. And I'm just going to cut that down, leaving just a small border of that chocolate cardstock around that little sticker there. Next, I'm going to take my Tombow Mono multi-glue to adhere that to the craft cardstock, which is super thick. It's almost like a chipboard. And this comes in the kit as well. Doing that same thing. I find it easier to stick it to a corner and then trim off the 2 sides, but you can certainly measure and cut it out prior to actually sticking it down. Going to go ahead and use my paper trimmer to cut down this, again, leaving just a small border. Keep in mind, this is pretty thick, so you're going to want to make sure that you have a super sharp trimmer. Next, it was looking a little too plain for me. Again, needed to add a little bit of color, and in that sentiment, there is a small little pink heart. So I'm using some of the pink cardstock from the kit, and I'm doing the same exact thing. Now it's starting to get pretty thick at this point. It's more like an embellishment instead of a sentiment strip. So I didn't really cut it too evenly. I left too much of a border on this one. So instead of trying to fit this into my trimmer, being it's so thick, I am going to take my scissors and be very careful. And I actually succeeded in cutting a straight line this time. And then that will be my embellishment. Now this is really nice and thick, so you're not going to want to use foam tape on this because it's just going to be way too much to mention. So I also took another piece of that pink cardstock and cut that just slightly larger than my card panel. And I'm going to go ahead and adhere everything together. Going to lay everything flat down and use one of the ivory, a piece of the ivory cardstock, or I'm sorry, that's my card base. I created a card base using the ivory cardstock, and I'm going to adhere everything together, including that sentiment strip. Now, looking at this, I had the pink for the border, but there wasn't any pink in my images. So I felt like it needed a little bit more pink to the card itself rather than just the border. So I ended up taking a couple of the heart stamps that are part of the same stamp set, and I'm going to do the same thing as far as the white pigment ink. So I think I stamped 3 of them, 2 of the larger hearts and 1 of the smaller hearts just in the gaps where between the little leaves. And again, just making sure that I have really good coverage before stamping that down. Let this dry for about 10 or 15 minutes. Now, in this case, you do not want to heat set it now that my card is put together because you're going to melt the adhesive that you already have on there and your card will start to fall apart. So let it air dry. It doesn't take too long. And this time I am going to bring in Hollyhock ink, also by Simon Says Stamp, which is significantly darker than the cotton candy. But like I said, once you stamp over that pigment ink, it does kind of lighten everything up. Stamping that just slightly off to the right-hand side again, just leaving a small white border on the left-hand side of each of my little hearts. And I liked this much better. I have a little bit of pink within my images now. So that is the 3rd card. Moving on to card number 4. We are going to do a little bit of ink blending. So I'm taking a piece of Nina Solar White and some Post-it note tape, using the grid mat to kind of line up my Post-it note tape to make sure that everything is lined up perfectly. Going to be working on a scrap piece of paper and using some Distress Oxide inks. I'm going to be using Carved Pumpkin, Abandoned Coral, and Picked Raspberry. And these colors really blend nicely together. Going to use some blendability brushes just because they're sitting there. Going to start off with the Picked Raspberry on the bottom, Carved Pumpkin in the middle, and Abandoned Coral on the top. And I kind of work my way up to the top, and then I'll work my way back down to the bottom, making sure that these colors blend. My first time around, I'm just getting the color on the paper, and then I kind of worry about getting everything blended. Sometimes I'm adding more ink to my brush there, and other times I'm just using whatever's on there to make sure that my colors blend nicely. Now I wanted to do a little bit of tone on tone stamping on top of my little ink blended area, so I'm leaving my Post-it note tape in place at this point. And I'm taking a few of the little flower stamps in the stamp set, and I'm using the same color ink that I'm stamping over. So I'm starting off with the Abandoned Coral on the top, and then I'll switch over to the Carved Pumpkin, and I'm just kind of spreading these out. Sometimes I'm stamping kind of off my little strip there onto the Post-it note tape, and other times I'm just leaving my whole image right on that strip. Once all of my stamping was done, I'm going to very carefully remove my Post-it note tape, making sure that my fingers don't get too inky and I don't get fingerprints where I don't want them to be. Once that was done, I made sure it was pretty dry before I moved on to the next step. Again, I didn't want to smear any of the ink. Then I'm going to bring out my Misty just to make sure that I get a bold black outline for my sentiment. I'm going to go ahead and use the grid lines on my Misty door, and sometimes I kind of have to move this around so it doesn't blend in with the grid mat that I'm working on to make sure this is straight. And I'm going to go ahead and stamp this with Blackout ink by Ink on 3, and I did stamp this twice just again to make sure I have a really bold image. Now these letters are open, so I'm going to take a Copic marker that is pretty close to the Picked Raspberry, and I'm just going to fill in my letters. I'm not doing any blending here. I'm just okay with it being solid color. And I did slightly go out of the lines, and you will not want to use a colorless blender with a color like this. So I'm just taking my white gel pen to kind of fix up some of those areas that I went out of the line. And this was still looking a little plain, so I wanted to give my strip a border. So I'm taking an EK Success journaling pen, but you can really use any black pen in this case. And I'm using my T-square ruler, and I'm just going slightly outside of my little ink blended strip there and just going straight across. And this will kind of frame everything in and just add a little bit of interest to the card. It is very plain, clean, and simple. So for the rest of my sentiment, I am going to create a sentiment strip, taking out a piece of black cardstock from my stash, treated that with my anti-static tool, and taking one of the small sentiments in the stamp set and stamping that with Versamark ink. I'm going to be using some white Hero Arts embossing powder, and I will heat set that, making sure that my heat gun is heated up before bringing that to the paper. And then I will use my paper trimmer just to cut that down into a very skinny little strip. Next, I decided to cut down my panel a little bit, and then I will cut a piece of that same black cardstock just slightly larger than my panel, but just slightly smaller than my card base itself. So I think I took about 1/4 of an inch off my card panel itself. So this brought it down to 5 1/4 by 4. And then my black mat, or whatever you want to call it, is just a little bit larger than that. Gluing everything down flat with my Tombow Mono multi-glue, I decided not to pop up my sentiment. I decided just to kind of leave that flat. And again, some of that ink, or that Copic ink, is kind of seeping through where I put that white gel pen down. So I am going to go back and add a little bit more of that white gel pen, but you do want to make sure that the first layer is dry before you do that, because you'll kind of just move around whatever ink you have down. So make sure the first layer is dry before you add any more. So that is card number 4. Moving on to the 5th and final card. Again, very simple pattern paper. Using a piece of the ivory cardstock and two stitched circle dies, one that's pretty small and the other one that's fairly large. Going to center the large one and then just cut out the smaller one anywhere because it doesn't matter. And then I'm using a piece of the pattern paper as my background. Now this is going to be plain, but I want it to be, I needed to add a little bit something. I stuck one of the stickers down in the center of that middle circle and decided to use the diagonal stitched rectangle die by MFT. This was sitting on my desk, so I tend to use the same dies over and over and over. I just recently moved, so my craft room is not 100% organized. So once I have materials out, those are the ones I kind of stick to for a while. So I cut out my ivory panel with that diagonal stitched rectangle die, and I will also cut out my pattern paper with that same die so that they're the same exact size. Going to go ahead and adhere that pattern paper down to my A2 size note card, and I'm just using a white note card here. And then I'm going to pop up the ivory panel using a whole lot of Scotch foam tape that I had to kind of cut into little teeny tiny skinny strips. But you'll want to make sure that as much as you can have the entire back of it covered the best you can so you don't have any gaps. Go ahead and remove the backing of my Scotch foam tape and line that up the best I can with that pattern paper so that none of that is showing through any of the 4 sides. Once that was down, I used some more Scotch foam tape to pop up that middle circle and tried to center that the best I could. I was going to add some embellishments here, but just decided to leave this really, really simple, like all 5 of the cards that we created today were. So here is another quick look at all 5 cards that we created today. Thank you guys so much for stopping by. I will leave all of the supplies in the description box below. Have a great day. Bye.